Hi everyone, thank you for joining me in the 7th session as we continue our quest to learn an API in PHP. Just a reminder, we are using the Joomla framework, so this is just to speed up the process. Links to the Joomla framework can be found below. If this video is the first video that you're watching, I highly recommend you watch the entire playlist. I've placed the first link below where you can actually find that. If you'd like to download the code, you can find it at the Github Repository. So that's github.com/redbluesquare/Joomla-framework-API. Today, we'll be creating new messages. So to do that, we will need a new messages controller and a model. We will also need to update the routing so that when we post the new messages, we can route those to the relevant messages controller. In turn, do all the legwork with the messages model and save the information. We'll be passing 3 pieces of information. So we'll have a token, we'll have our app token, and we'll also have the message that we want to send. The token will be used to validate the user. From that, we will get the user ID, and we will use that user ID together with the message to then save in the database under DDC messages, or I think I have as DDC posts. And then from that, we will feed back to the user that it was successful. Lastly, we'll also create a second task just to be able to read the messages from a single user. So we'll be able to pass a token and just to a single URL and get all the messages back for that user. Okay, so if you have any questions about the API, please post them below. Otherwise, let's get coding, guys. What I like to do is copy an existing model and an existing controller and then work from there. I always find that that gives me the best possible code as I continue creating my application. I simply copy the existing profile and paste it, then rename it to the model that I would like to create. Here, this is going to be messages model, and we will also copy the profiles controller, paste it, and then rename it to be our messages controller. There's a typo, so we do not want a double S. Now that we have our messages controller, we can now begin to change the code within our messages controller. We still want to keep the profiles model. We also want to add a messages model. And we want to rename the controller name to messages controller. For this model, we will now call this profile model. And then we will copy it and create our messages model. And this will just be called model. So the naming convention, if it's just model, it matches the name. So messages, then I just use model. But if I am accessing a different model, so for instance the profiles model, I then like to actually name it profile model. We can actually call it profiles model just to keep the naming uniform. And from there we can copy that function and paste it below. For this login, we won't require this function below, but we will rename this to be add. So initially we have these two, and this is just our index. So we will use this for retrieving a list of messages back, and we will use the add task to actually create a new message. The first thing that we would like to do here is change this register to authenticate. And we will actually call it authenticate_token. Another way that you could do it is just create a capital T. So let's go with this naming convention. So we have a new model called authenticate token, which is going to be accessed from our messages model. So in order to do that, we need to go to our messages model. And here we need to update the naming of our messages model. We want to keep this token. For now, we will also keep this, but we will rename this here so that we are actually getting dev1 DDC posts. So we can actually do that straight away. Here this table is going to be DDC posts, and we are going to call it P. And for now, let's just say we are getting all the content from it. We will go through and update the rest of it as we go. So here we have this register, and we now want to call this authenticate token. And as before, we are getting this get method, so we need to ensure that it's post. We also want to ensure that this app token, which is here on top, is being requested. From there, we are then going to access our token, which has been sent from the user. So it is just going to be called token, and we are also going to get the message. So here we will call this message as well. So they're both just going to be strings. The rest of the information we will not need. So this date, we still want to keep this date. And the remainder of the information is not required. Now, something that I actually made a mistake here was this function. So if we just look at this function overall, this authenticate token, we actually want this function to be in our profiles model. So for the authentication process, we are going to access it from our profiles model to actually see, is this user authenticated? So I've just lifted it up from the messages model, and I've pasted it at the bottom of the profiles model. So in our messages controller, here we want to call this profiles model authenticate token. So what is this token going to do? Well, once you get the token, we now want to pass the token into our database and validate it against the actual database to see, okay, is this a registered token? So what we can see here in our dev1 DDC user keys, we have 2 tokens. So we are going to pass through one of these tokens and get back the user ID. So a simple way of achieving that, from the very top, if we use this build query function, we are going to just simply copy all of that information, come down to our token here, and we are going to create a new query. So here we are going to say get query. This is going to be user keys, so UK, and user ID. So the only information that I want back is the user ID. I'm passing in the user token. So here we will say get it from user keys, and our key is UK. And then we are going to request where UK dot token is equal to this token on top. So we need double colon our token dot and close the bracket. So this token, because it's text, we need to pass in a double colon. And here, this is user keys. So user key ID. So here we are just getting this DDC user key ID. We want to group by that, but we are only going to pass back one result. So in order to pass back one result, we're actually going to look at our default model. And here, this result is, we are just loading a single object. So instead of returning the query at this point, we are just going to load back a single object. So this db set query, so we set in the query, and then the result is going to be our object of the user ID. And this result we are then going to pass back. Now before we pass back the result, we also want to say result equals array success of false. So as standard, I always like to create this array, create a success of false, and in here we will call this our item that we are getting back. So if this works out to be true, I then want to pass in the result of user ID, which is equal to the item user ID. And I also want to get the result of success and make that true. So if this all validates, I'm going to get a true response coming back. Another option that we could do just to validate this so that we don't get any errors, we could say if this actually returns a result, we then want to get the user ID, set it to true, and then we are going to load that information back to our result. So we can save our profiles model. It will then load back to our result. So we will have this so this is our profile user ID, or let us just call it array user ID. Again, where we're passing back item. So like here where we set this result of false, what we can do here is set the item to be false. So we're initializing it with false. We're then carrying out our steps, and if everything works out to be true and we are able to post our message, so at this next step we can say if array user ID, and we're checking success. So if this is true, let us continue our process where we will post the message. So in order to post the message, we want to create a save query in our messages model. So now we can come back to this messages model and we can call it save. Let's call it save message. We are going to get that information as before. We are going to pass in the user ID. The message is coming from the request, so we will just pick up the message at this point. It is going to be a string. I also want to get the date. So here in our profiles model where we had this date, we do not need it in this, but we do want to access this date in our message. Now to save this request, if we go to our default model, we have different options here. So we have a insert function, we have an update function. Here we won't need this function, so this is just validating a user email address, but we then also have our standard get item by ID, get item by alias. So we are going to be using this insert function up here, and what we are going to do is always ensure that it is a post. So what we are doing is we're checking, okay, is it a post? And then we are going to insert the information into the table using certain columns and also certain data. So this function takes 3 pieces of information: the table, the columns, and the data. And we have done this before in our profiles model. So here, when we are registering a user and also creating a user token, here we have created this insert function. So we are going to be building on the same function, which just reduces the amount of code that we are actually creating. So here where we are saving the message, let's go to our table. So DDC user keys, DDC posts. And in DDC posts, currently there's nothing. So there's a few other options where you can see we can return the parent post, also a category. We're not going to use any of these. We are simply going to insert the message. We'll insert or create a new ID, which is going to be incrementing. We will save when it was created, who created it, so the user ID once again, and we will insert a state of 1 just to show that it is published. So the piece of information we will be adding is all of them across except the ID, the modified by, and modified on. So here we have columns, and then we also have the data that we want to pass. So we are just going to copy those. We no longer need this information here. So the columns token time is no longer required. So in our columns, yes, we need, okay, who has created it? So we do need the user ID, but we need to name this first one category. The next one is post parent. The next one is message. The next is created on, created by. Created by. And finally, we are going to have state. So these are the columns that we are going to be updating. So for the first column, we are going to post in just a 0. For the second column, the post parent, once again, we are going to post in 0 because we do not want to actually post any parent post, so it's no reply to a post. For the message, we are going to post the message and then created on is going to be the date, and created by is going to be the user ID, and the state is going to be 1. So likewise, we could post these as integers. This should not matter. And finally, we are going to create the insert function. So if we are able to insert this information to posts with the columns and the data, it should provide us a result of true, and then we can pass back the information. So here we can then pass back the result. So if this all works out to be true, we want to pass back result success and pass back that to the user. So here we do not actually need to pass back the information because we already know where this information was being posted. What we could do is here in our result, if we would like to, we could post back DDC post ID. So if I actually show you in our default model, so last ID as ID. So once we've posted the information, we actually are able to retrieve the ID that we've just set. So to do that, here we could call this message, and then we can access this message ID. And by doing that, we can then return that to the user of, this is the ID of the message that was posted. So if this first part is correct, we now want to say user equals model, and this is called save message. And here from this user array, we are getting the user ID, and we are posting that user ID back into that save message function. To just clean up our messages model, let us delete anything that is not required. So get user, this function is not part of our messages. And then before we were looking at this here, so we can just now clean up any code. So we want to group by the ID, and then any where queries. For now, we are just going to have a single one. So just the post ID. Okay, and here they are all P, so we need to ensure that we are referencing P in all cases. And we will call this message ID. So this top part now looks good. Here we have our save message, which also looks good. We are returning the ID. So in our messages controller, we then need to save this message. And just to be on the safe side, once again, we could put this in a if statement. So if that works out to be true, let us then say item and changing our success to equal true. So here was originally false, now we're saying this is true, and let us also say item message ID. Here instead of user, let's say message $message, and we call this DDC post ID. So we are updating that information, and then we are going to pass it back. So our authenticate token is now complete. We are returning success is true with the user ID, passing that back. We are then saving the message in our messages model. So once again, doing our validation, checking that message, saving all the data. If that is successful, we are returning success true, the post ID, and then we are saving that information as an item, returning it to the user. So as one final step, our config file, apologies, it's not our config file, but our routing file. So here now we need to create a new route, which is, instead of our profiles, we are now calling this messages. And messages will take a task, it will also have an ID, and that is going to access the messages controller in both cases. Okay, and I think we are almost all done. Let's go to Postman. Here we will copy the existing URL. Let's create a new URL. Instead of profiles, we're now calling this messages because this is what we have specified. And if we are not posting any information, so in our body we are going to keep this blank first of all, and let's just send it and let's see what we get. So here it is giving us an error that messages does not exist, but here we have updated it. So let's check our messages controller. Right, that appears to be set, but it is still saying that. Okay, I will just try to understand what exactly this error is, and then I will be back shortly. So what I actually found was when we post this, we get this error. But if I enter add and I send it through, we then get success or false with this item returning back. And the reason for this is here in our messages, if you notice, we originally had 3 in this instance, but here we only have 2. So because we do not have a default without a task, it is always expecting a task to be sent, and therefore it then gives the error. If we add that extra line and we just add messages, so here we get items and this is empty. So the reason it is empty, we have not added any validation, but we are getting a list of items and obviously there are no messages to return. So if we now go to add and we want app token, we also want our message. So for the app, and we also want a token. So for the token, we are going to use this token from our last tutorial. For the app token, we will use the default app token that we have been using, and for our message, this is our first message on to create an API in PHP. If we send this, undefined token, so here this is in profiles model 152. So in our profiles model 152, so here it is saying, okay, this token is undefined. I forgot the $sign. Once again, let's send it. So now we have a few more errors. So column count does not match. So in our messages model, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But how many are we actually posting? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So because we are posting 7 items, but we only have 6 on top, something isn't matching. So we have a category, we have a post parent, we have our message, we have the created on, the created by, should be the user ID, so we had an extra 0 in there, and then the state, which is 1. So by default, we're just always posting it as published. So here we could, if we wanted to actually post a state, so we could say something is private or public, etc. So we could have a state and then have either 1 or 2 or 3, etc. for the different states. We're not going to be using the state as a variable, but that is very easy to integrate. You would just add another line here and you would call this state, and then instead of sending one, you would add state. So both options are possible. Let us send this through. So here it has all has worked, but we are still getting this notice. And if we have this notice, it means we are not going to get this JSON back to the user in the format that we actually need. So in our messages controller on line 28, we're getting a property of a non-object. So messages controller line 28 here, and what it actually was, we had turned this from a object, we had turned it into an array. So here I even have the word array user ID, but I then set it as a user object. So that was causing an error. So if we post it again, here message ID, which is successful, is now number 2. Again, if we copy this, we now should have 2 posts. If we just sending it without any information, this is our first message, and first one has one ID. You can see here created by, the user ID doesn't exist because we weren't getting the user ID in the correct method, but here it does exist, so that is actually working as expected. But what happens, because here we don't actually want this user ID message to come back because this is not the person who created the post. So if this is not the person who created the post, we only want to filter from that user. What do we need to do? So again, we need to create our verification, which can be done here. And then from that, we can then use this information and pass in the array user ID into our list items. And if we remember when we were actually over here, so we are able to get things by the post ID, but we can actually extend this. So let's call that PID, and let's call this UID. So this is the user ID. So the query here, this could be the post ID or the user ID. So if we are using the post ID and it is a number and it's greater than 1, then we are just going to get the post ID. Otherwise, what we would like to do is, if we copy this information, paste it here, we want to say, okay, if the UID is not null, then let us go by the user ID and get the UID here. So if we come back, so where we are list items, we will pass in null and then the user ID. And now if we send the information through, okay, we get an error. And so what has gone wrong in this? We had the bracket in the incorrect place. So once again, let's send the information through. So here it's null. So it's saying items are not defined. And here, this request has not been validated. So again, we need to initialize our items. So here we are getting nothing. So why are we getting nothing? Because we are not posting any information. So what will we need to post? For starters, we need to post the app token. I don't think it is valid in this instance, but let's post it. And let's also post the token of the user. So once we post both of these, we can send the information through. Okay, so now it's saying p user, so unknown column. Yes, because p user ID does not exist. That is correct, because here we want to say created by, because there's no user ID by default in our table. And eventually we have success. We've got our user. This is our first message on how to create an API in PHP. Okay, so that was a bit difficult at times, lots of error handling, but we got there in the end. Guys, I hope you have enjoyed the series on how to create an API in PHP. It has not been the very cleanest. There's been some errors along the way. Personally, I enjoyed when I see a video and there are errors in there. It just helps to understand, okay, what are the errors that the person sees? What are they actually doing to correct those errors? So what are the error messages and what do they actually mean to the user? Because sometimes it can be a generic error message, but it's the clues inside the error message, what to actually look for. If you have any questions or comments on the tutorials that I've been posting, please leave your feedback, good, bad, the ugly. It doesn't matter, I'm always looking to improve. So all those negative points, I can use that to actually improve in the future. Guys, thank you for joining me. This has been a slightly longer one. I just wanted to cover a bit more in this to show you how do we actually post a message, how do we use tokens, transfer them to actually mean, okay, this token has been posted, who is the token from, get the user ID, then use that information to subsequently post messages, etc. There's a whole array of things you can do. You can have more than one token that you are using. So you could have a master token, and if this token then expires, you then can use the master token to request a new token. So there's a whole host of things that you can do. But here's the basics. If you are able to create things of a slightly different variant, please post your messages below with the links where it can be found, and I'd love to see what you've created. Hope you guys enjoyed this. See you guys soon, and Happy New Year.